All right, we have our first source presentation of the class.
Oh boy. Is this a touchscreen or do I just have you?
Just hit that space bar.
Okay. So my readings were on the selections from the pyramid texts, and most of these, even though they're not explicitly written to be theological writings or works, they are more written to be eulogy or funeral rite, but still a lot of important theological information can be inferred from the pyramid texts. So the purpose of the texts was to send a pharaoh to the next life. And this is, I believe, the pharaoh in question sitting on the lap of his mother, Pepi.
Pepi.
Yeah. So
Pepi the first.
I think so.
Yeah, that's all right. It's okay. I shouldn't disrupt you. Go ahead.
Where was I?
See? The purpose of the text.
Purpose of the text. All right. So, for a long while, actually, many researchers believed these texts to just kind of be funeral rites or burial rites that were discovered with the tomb. But as they researched them a little more and translated them to get a deeper understanding of what the texts meant, they found that they could get some information related to how the gods functioned in ancient Egypt and how a pharaoh would be resurrected into a god after they passed away. So the text makes many references to spiritual journeys of pharaohs, which seem to be a little more important than a normal Egyptian's death and spiritual journey, because the pharaoh, we know of the Ba and the Ka as parts of as aspects of the soul in Egyptian theology, but the pharaoh, his soul would be transformed into an Ach, which is like this higher form or tier of soul. At least that's what I got from the reading. The texts make many references to what we already know about mummification and preparing bodies to prevent decay, to sort of symbolize spiritual longevity or living for eternity after the pharaoh has passed away. The texts also make references to pharaohs being buried with their possessions in life that were carried on over into death so that they could make their spiritual journey into godhood. What is really interesting about these texts is that they are really repeated over and over again like an incantation, like a reminder or a petition to the gods to let the pharaoh pass over into the next life. I forgot who this particular pharaoh is, but you can see, I believe that is a priest in an Anubis mask, symbolizing preparation for the body as it goes into the afterlife. Now, when a pharaoh is, his soul, when it is transformed into the Ach, it is taken by, or accepted by Re Atum, or Ra Atum, who basically is considered the father, like the literal spiritual father of the pharaoh as he passes on. And the god Horus brings all of the other gods together. It is such an important event in this theological structure that the god Horus brings all the other minor gods together to acknowledge and accept the pharaoh as he is turned into a god. Now, these last two texts, I think, really capture how important the utterances are to making the pharaoh a god and how important the pharaoh's passing is considered to ancient Egyptians. This is not just a really important king passing away. This is literally a person joining the mythos of the Egyptian theology. So the first utterance, utterance 570, deals with deification. This is Pepi. This Pepi is the blood which came forth from Isis. He is the blood which came forth from the Nephthys. He will gird up his loins, and there's nothing the gods can do against him. The pharaoh is such a close son of Re-Atum that he is considered a high god, not just another one of the many gods that joined the ranks of the pharaoh deities that passed away. In utterance 571, eternal son, this once again shows the importance of the pharaoh as he becomes a high god. Horus has extended his two arms to him, even to this Pepi, that he may entrust this Pepi to Shu, who raises his arms to support the sky. O Ra, give your hand to this Pepi. O great God, give your staff to this Pepi, so that he may live into eternity. It's once again showing that relationship of the Egyptian high gods with the pharaoh. So, like I said, they are not just a funeral rite. They're not just a eulogy. They are a full transformation of the pharaoh into a god in ancient Egyptian theology. And that is to conclude, it's just a really interesting text that, even though it doesn't specifically deal with theology, it gives a lot of cool information about how they believed it worked.
So why are they called pyramid texts?
Oh, because they are found in the ancient tombs, the pyramids of the pharaohs. Sorry. I should have probably acknowledged that first.
That's all right. That's all right. Anybody else have any questions? Oh, thank you. Just want you to know that way's north.
That was good. Why did you just say that? You know so much background knowledge.
All right, very good. Next source, maxims.
It's not on the screen.
What? It's not on the screen. Okay, here's our next presentation.
Okay, so is this touchscreen right here?
No.
Oh, okay.
The space bar.
You could hit the space bar. You could touch this screen. I don't know if that would advance it or not. It does.
So I did my presentation on the maxims of Ptahhotep. And Ptahhotep was a vizier. We learned about the viziers last week, so they're kind of like the right-hand man to the pharaoh. What's interesting about Ptahhotep was he thought that, everyone thought that he was going to succeed after the pharaoh. And it doesn't say in the text if he ended up doing that. I just kind of did background research on him, but this was one of the world's first completed books, and it is formed as early as the late 6th dynasty of the Old Kingdom, so it's really old. It's definitely not the oldest text that we have, but it's up there, and we have the complete version, so it's pretty cool. It contains practical suggestions for a way of life, and the one that I focused on was more of mannerisms, and he wrote this to his son as with the hopes that he would be taking over his position as vizier when he retired. So it's kind of like a letter, but it's also very general, so anybody could read it and glean from it. It is based on the concepts of ma'at. So ma'at is kind of like this, it says if you do not live in ma'at, you will fall into mischief. So ma'at is the idea of it's not necessarily a god, it's just like a being. I don't know if you could explain that further, but...
It's the right order of things. In other words, it's the way that things ought to be. Yeah. So it's almost like a destiny. It's almost like fate, because there's a position, there's what you are to be. Let's say you're to be a peasant and you're to be a farmer and you're to work out in the fields. If you start desiring to be the pharaoh or somebody else, that's not your ma'at. That's not your right order.
Right.
And if you start doing that, then it's going to lead you into trouble. Mm-hmm. If the pharaoh, would think, oh, it'd be nice not to be the pharaoh. Maybe I should be something else. I should be a merchant or whatever. I should just want to get away, so I don't want to have all this responsibility. That would also be denying your order, your balance. You're not following the rules of your life.
Yeah, which kind of kept the society in check, and
right.
Left who was in power. So I wonder if that was something that they truly believed, or they just kind of inflicted the idea upon other people so that they wouldn't be overthrown. But I don't know. So
it's good to be the king.
Yeah. Ma'at just is. It's just kind of, it's not a spiritual thing, I don't think. I think it is to a certain extent, but it's just the way they saw life. And some ideas that are presented in the maxims are think highly of yourself, be humble, and treat others with respect. So you see these come to play. The focus is comparable to modern American mannerisms and similar to Hebrew proverbs. So when Ptahhotep was writing this to his son, he was just explaining the way that he wanted the Egyptian society to live, and even things as simple as making eye contact with people. They're very practical suggestions for a way of life. So I'm going to get into a little bit more.
It's good to have shifty eyes, I've noticed.
Okay, so I put Paula Deen up here because...
Paula Deen?
Yes, I will explain. So here are the quotes. It says, if you come up against an aggressive adversary, your equal, one who is one of your own social standing, you will prove yourself more upright than he by remaining silent when he speaks vengefully. And basically that sounds a lot to me like if you don't have anything nice to say, don't say anything at all. Like a southern woman like Paula Deen would probably handle the situation.
I see.
So I kind of like tied her in here just to have like a mental image of how the American mannerisms are still carrying the culture that they were then.
Sometimes when I'm talking to a person, I'll say, my mother told me if you don't have anything nice to say, don't say anything. That's why I'm not saying anything.
Mm-hmm.
You think maybe I shouldn't even say that?
And then another example is if you should be one of those sitting as guests at the table of someone who is greater than you, accept what he serves when it is placed in front of you. And I don't know how you guys were raised, if you were picky eaters at all, but in my house, like, if somebody fed us something, we at least tried it because somebody made it, and, like, my mom did not want us to be picky eaters, and just, she wanted us to be grateful for what we had. So that's just another mannerism that was kind of culturally accepted, and everybody should have abided by in Ma'at, if you will.
You ever tried scorpion?
No.
It tastes pretty good.
I have had scorpion in China.
Cool.
Out on the street. It was like a street. Well, anyway.
I think I would try it. I don't know. But that's because of my
It
mannerisms.
tastes like
Shout out to
deep
Potato
fried
Tip.
peanut butter.
Okay, and then some Hebrew proverbial similarities. So train a child in the way he should go. I'm sure a lot of you have heard, or all of you have heard that verse, and it's not, that verse does not, any of the Proverbs actually do not say that, like, if you follow these Proverbs, this will happen. It is not always A plus B equals C, because life happens and sometimes gets in the way of things, and somebody who raises their child in a good Christian home, their child may completely go off the edge because God had a different plan and he's going to do something different with it. But I brought that verse into this because I think that the Hebrew Proverbs parallel the way that Ptahhotep thought that life was going to be. He said that, no, it's not always going to be this way, but at least we should try to live in this kind of manner. So, yeah.
So it says here, a guy might decide to cheat you, but in the end, that guy will lose, right?
Yeah.
All right. That's good.
Okay, so now it's your guys' turn to turn and talk to each other, or we could just discuss as a group. It caused me to ponder, is this a rule of thumb that has existed throughout culture, or are these mannerisms an example of moral relativism? So we see a lot of these same ideas throughout different cultures and throughout time. Do you think that's just by accident? Because the culture has passed it down, or do you think it's morally relative to behave in this way?
Well, if you've heard the C.S. Lewis course, or if you're interested in that at all, he kind of appeals to this idea that all cultures have a tinge of truth inside of them, even if they aren't the direct absolute truth, but that there is aspects of that inside of each moral aspect of culture. And I think that I think it is kind of sort of a moral inclination that just kind of transcendentally exists. Like, people know these things because they can just infer the consequences of what it is to do these things, and that it doesn't really benefit everyone in the end.
Mm-hmm. Does anybody else?
It seems to me, I don't know why you would call it moral relativism. If different cultures have come up with the same thing, doesn't necessarily mean it's morally relative. It could mean it's just true. And that they have recognized the truth. In other words, if you want, that if somebody, like for example, that last one, if somebody cheats somebody, in the end they won't get ahead.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, if I'm paraphrasing, but and we do find that kind of idea in the Bible. We do find that idea here.
Yeah.
I don't know if that means it's relative or relative. In other words, like it could mean that it is an absolute truth that many cultures have recognized. That in that case, through observation, that the guy who ends up cheating everybody in the end, something happens to him. You know, some people call it karma. Some people call it fate. Some people call it what goes around comes around. You know, I don't know. But yeah, I mean, I think I do think that there are aspects of life that different people can see. This is the way it, you know, or you know, like looking at somebody when you're talking to them, or treating people fairly. These are pretty standard things across cultures. I think just because they are true.
Yeah, I definitely agree. I just
That's good.
was looking for
Makes us
different
positive,
thoughts.
but nobody else said anything, so I'm going to be quiet.
All right.
Now we have to call on people.
So those are
She just wants out. Okay.
that's all.
What's the YouTube?
It was like this. It was kind of weird, but it was this 40-minute interview of these Egyptologists
Really?
talking about.
All right, I'll have to look at it. Thank you. All right, here's our next source.
All right, so I did mine on the teachings for King Merikari. Some of the context behind this. It takes place during the first intermediate period, but most likely it was written during the Middle Kingdom. So it's written quite a time after when it's supposed to be taking place. I kind of imagine it as, like, let's say nowadays we're writing like a piece on like 1800s or something. Maybe not exactly the same, but still, it's being written at a future point in time. It's probably from a father to a son, or one ruler speaking to the next ruler. Maybe it's changing dynasties, but essentially it's for Merikari and advice on what he should do while being king. So one of the big issues during the first intermediate period was political instability. In the back of our Atlas book, it was showing between the 8th and 10th dynasties. They didn't even have anything for the 7th, but it had like 18 plus for the 8th and 18 plus for 9th and 10th. So estimate like 35 to 40 plus rulers within a span of 3 to 4 dynasties, about 150 years. So not very good. Whereas Middle Kingdom, when this is probably written, much more unified, much more stability. So the way I approached this was through different themes talked about in the text. So the first theme I talked about was political control. There was a lot of focus on staying in power. Like the first few pages of the text were talking about like insurrections or people trying to usurp power, or just someone that's trying to stir something up. The person goes on to say, even if this person has good standing with other people and they're very well known and all that, if they have this intent, kill them, kill their family. So don't let them take power, and do this because if you kill off these people, it'll subdue the masses and they won't have any uprisings. That hasn't really worked in the long scheme of things.
Maybe because they didn't kill enough.
Perhaps, but maybe didn't want to marks.
I've been watching a lot of gangster mob drug stuff, drug lords. But in the end, they always get it.
Yes. So yeah, a lot of distrust, possibly some paranoia there. Also, kings are a lot more realistic with their concerns because they're dealing with more issues than, say, a king during a time of unity. Those kings wouldn't have to worry a whole lot, whereas these guys, they have to worry every few years someone else is coming in power. And so it's a lot more concerned about being able to keep control. So the next theme I talked about is character. And I thought this was kind of interesting because it went from talking about killing someone and their whole family if they try to conspire against you to saying don't kill people just for typical crimes, only like flogging or imprisonment.
Well, one is if they cross you.
Yeah.
The other one they did.
Yes. So one could be an argument of like treason versus
Right.
irregular, like stealing something.
Go against the king, you've committed high treason.
Another thing is loyalty was a big thing in order to have that control to prevent uprisings. And so advice included in this and these teachings were give them stuff, because if you give them stuff, they won't lack anything, and so they will have no need to be able to take over you. And if you give to people, they'll be able to give you in return. Another thing, which a little specific one, was quarrying your own stone instead of taking it and plundering it from other monuments, because this was more respectful, and this kind of ties into my last theme, but it's kind of reverence to other kings from the past, and how that could potentially affect you in your afterlife because of your lack of moral character. These two things, while they might have different ends, one of them being able to have political control and the other one maybe to have a good standing in the afterlife, they have the same means of carrying on good character. And my third theme was religion or the afterlife. Big focus on that. There was a lot of mention of Ba, kind of your personality, and it, as I understand, it's kind of embodied through like a bird with the head of a human that kind of flies back between life and death. And I didn't understand it a whole lot. That's what I got from it. But it did speak a lot on that, where the Ba can't return back to the body after one dies. But I don't know where I'm going with this. I just remember something about Ba, and I got lost with it. But I wanted to mention it. Reference to past kings, as I mentioned before. I didn't include this, but Ma'at, that was also mentioned a few times in there. I don't know if it was referring to the goddess or if it was referring to just the concept of Ma'at, but regardless, same premise: truth, justice, law. Make sure you practice that. And this life affects the next. There's a quote in there, I don't remember it exactly, but it was saying, even like the small amount of time you have here affects the afterlife, which sounds very similar to some things preached in churches nowadays, where what you do now can affect your entire eternity. Not to say that those are the same things, but there's a time.
Better watch yourself.
Yes, I got to make sure I don't cheat on this, otherwise that might affect my.
See the afterlife.
So my conclusion: there are a lot of responsibilities for the king during this time, and I think more so during the intermediate period than the Middle Kingdom. But I think if you're looking in terms of historiography, I think there's an issue of anachronism, where this is being written very much after when it's supposed to be taking place. And so this is after Egypt is going to be reunified. This is when they know what to do and what not to do in terms of having political control. And they're essentially, whoever wrote this is taking that and putting it into the mouths of someone during that time of instability, who may not have had the ability or may not have known necessarily how to do that. So
maybe this is a warning. We go back and we know it was very unstable, and so now we're at a time when it's more stable. Well, let's make sure we don't let's learn from the mistakes of the past.
In one aspect, I think the ability to have hindsight and see the mistakes is good, but if you're writing this as a historical account of what someone is saying they should do, I think that's a historical error right there, and it's creating a false history. But other than that, I found it interesting. So, yes.
Well, I'm getting ready to publish my diary on Abraham Lincoln. We'll have a lot of good moral teachings.
We're excited.
All right. Any questions? It's all right. You can leave it right there. Yeah. Any questions? No? Done 3. Well, we got one more. One more already. Okay, hang on a second. So next source.
Yeah. So I talked more about. Well, I wrote more onto like the actual, I guess, reading, since it was like only about like 2 pages and probably a quarter, not that long. But it was the teachings for the vizier, Kajmini. Is that how you say it? Kajmini?
Ka
Oh, Ka.
Jemi.
Kajmini.
Jimny.
All right, Kajmini. Well, the vizier
Jimny.
Kajmini. It was it was this preserved text that was in a papyrus, and it contained the main text of Maxims of
Tahota. We just heard about that.
Yep. But for this one, it was kind of different. The author of the text was the father of Kajmini. Probably Kajmini. All right. Yeah. It was assumed that he wrote the Chester Beatty
Papyri, Roman numeral 4. Now, do you guys have any idea what the Chester Beatty Papyri are and why they're called the Chester Beatty Papyri, or where you might go to see them? No.
That guy who discovered them. Wait, was he the guy who did all that grave robbing and smuggled all the stuff into a different country?
We don't like to use the word grave robbing. Exploration and well, these Chester Beatty Papyri are famous also because many of them contain biblical excerpts. They were found in Egypt, the whole collection of them. They are in, many of them are in England. I believe they're Manchester, University of Manchester, some of them, anyway. So they are numbered like this. So this convention of, he had all these different papyri that he found. They began to number them to keep track of them. All right, go ahead.
Yeah, I just found it very interesting to see that it was like a good amount of historian or Egypt. I don't know. Whoever could translate the hieroglyphics.
Yeah.
There was a lot of workers, so it's like not just one person sees it. It's a lot of people.
Yeah, it's a team.
Mm-hmm.
And Gardner, that guy, that name, if you end up studying more about Egypt or over the course of the semester, Alan Gardner's name will probably pop up because he has done a lot of work translating different texts. And then they usually have a team that goes back through it, like you see. Okay.
So what I have like sort of bolded and italicized is just the parts of the words or the text that I found pretty important, and it's quite similar to many of the other people that just presented. That basically, the submissive man prospers, the modern man is praised, and the tent is open for the silent man, and the place of the contented man is wide. Do not talk freely, for the flint knives are sharp against the one who strays from the road. There is no hastening except indeed against his misdeed. If you sit with a crowd, abstain from the food you desire, for controlling your desires only for a brief moment. So I found the first couple of texts, it's just basically be humble. At least that's how I interpreted it, to be humble. And if you listen to the people above you, you'll end up learning a lot more. You'll be blessed, just because sometimes when we're young, we're pretty stubborn, and we think we know everything. The talking so freely is basically learning how to tame your tongue. Obviously, it's like that reminded me of like the Bible, how our tongue needs. We need to learn how to tame our tongue because it's like a knife. Yeah. If you sit with a crowd, you abstain for the food you desire, for controlling your desires only for a brief moment. This just reminded me of like sometimes when you're within a bad crowd, it's just sometimes they like do things that you aren't like, that doesn't fit your morals, but you may be like persuaded to do it. But if you abstain from doing those things, then you feel it's only for that moment that you feel like doing it. But after, you're like, wow, I stayed strong. I stayed within my roots, and I didn't have to break what my father taught me. Down to the last two sentences. Base is one whose gut is greedy. When the mealtime has passed by, he should not be mindful of those who eat miraculously at home. So basically, he's trying to tell them to not eat so much. Take care of your temple, or take care of your body. Learn how to, even though when when your body's asking for food, learn how to like control yourself, because obviously.
I think also a lot of this is appearances, right? It's appearances. You have, everybody's watching you. I mean, like, don't talk freely. Why? Because other people are listening. Don't sort of eat too much. Sort of like when you go to this person's house, because it says somebody's going to point their finger and say, oh, look what this guy's doing, so forth. In other words, be aware that people are watching. Anyway, so because it'll reveal, I guess, reveals your character, but it also is kind of putting on an appearance for others.
Down here, I thought the most important part was, so let your good name go forth while you are silent in your speech, and you will be summoned. Yet do not be proud by virtue of your strength among your contemporaries. Basically, once again, to be humble. Sometimes when someone has a high position within the government or wherever they're working, they believe they're the best, and basically the power just gets to them, and they start wanting the people to have or to talk just about him. So he tries to tell them to not allow that to happen, to learn how to stay humble or try to be humble. And one does not know what will happen nor what God does when he punishes. So that I just found super interesting, because when we talk about God, obviously we know that we believe that he is all-knowing. I mean, they believe that if their God punishes them, they don't know how the punishment's going to end. So I found that pretty interesting. Then the vizier had his children summoned. This text was obviously to teach his children. Then they placed themselves on their bellies, and they read it out just as it was written. And it was more beautiful in their hearts than anything in this entire land. So they proceeded to live accordingly. Then His Majesty the King of Upper and Lower Egypt, Huni, died, and Majesty the King of Upper and Lower Egypt, Senefru, was exalted as an excellent king in this entire land. I'm probably going to butcher it again, but Kejmini was then made overseer of the residence town and vizier. So these kings basically kept the word of their father, and it ended up working out for the better because the people ended up loving them and had a good time within their reign. And a vizier is just the highest official in ancient Egypt to serve the pharaoh. But there's
a famous vizier mentioned in the Old Testament. Anybody know who it is? Joseph, yes. Joseph, right. And, often it's, this is the most powerful person besides the Pharaoh. And it is often someone who is a commoner. It's, usually somebody who, even a foreigner. There are other examples besides Joseph.
Right. All right. That was it.
That's it. All right. Any questions?
Comments? What's that?
I had a comment.
Go ahead.
So when it was talking about like watch as you say, watch as you eat, all that,
Which
kind of reminded me of modern day politics, of like being in front of the camera, knowing what to do. Don't do something that people are going to take as being,
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it's like I said, it's about appearances, right? So, I mean, I almost wonder if this last line, base is the one whose gut is greedy when the mealtime has passed. He should not be mindful of those who eat voraciously at home. So in other words, when you're in public, don't eat much. When you get home, then you can actually fill up, right? I mean, that's kind of what I'm taking from it. In other words, when everybody's watching you, be careful. Don't. Well, I mean, it could be like when I used to go to these things. You just pile stuff on your plate and just take it down. Like when I was at the seminary, this is back before we had all what I call interwebs. I would go and visit a lot of churches, and I would get there. They had what they called a newsletter that they would mail out. I know you never heard of that stuff, but they would mail out a church newsletter once a month or whatever, once a week, just depending on the church. I made sure I got about every time I went to one, I asked to be put on their mailing list. And then every week I would get these letters. And then what I would do is, to figure out where I was going to church that Sunday, I would see if anybody was having a dinner, a picnic, whatever. Because, and then I would go. And then when I would go, they would say, we're having a dinner after church today. And I said, oh, no, I didn't bring anything. And, oh, that's okay. We have plenty. You come on back. And then, oh, okay, thanks. And so, but I would not be bashful at those dinners. I would usually do it. But what he's saying is, if you are sort of in the spotlight, because nobody really knew me, so I didn't really matter, right? But if you're in the spotlight, then you got to be careful of your appearance, what you eat, what you say, what you do. And then when you get home, if you're still hungry, I think he's saying go ahead, eat at home, fill up at home if you're still hungry, but make sure you watch what you eat because people will talk about you. So yeah, I mean, I do think it is interesting that all these texts we've looked at today have been, for the most part, what we might call wisdom literature, except maybe for the pyramid text. Yours was a little different. But the others were what we might call wisdom literature. Let's say, if you're even looking at biblical texts, things like Proverbs and Psalms and even somewhat Job and some of those kinds of things were sort of talking about people are like this and you should be like this. And watch this. Be careful about this. And so I think that's interesting. A good observation about it. It's kind of like politics. Although, today people say they want. They say the newer generation, which I guess is you guys, wants. They don't want anybody to pretend, right? So I think that's why we see our politicians today are, at least some of them, not doing much pretending anymore. They're being pretty direct and not, they're not filtering. I mean, it used to be, especially for politicians, that everything that they would say, they would typically not say anything directly that hadn't gone through this whole process where, advisors and handlers and all these people would say, okay, how are we going to respond to this? This is a possible question they're going to ask. What answer are you going to? No, you can't say that answer. Let's say it like this or say it like that. And then they would get there and they would sometimes give a non-answer answer. But today, at least some politicians, I'm not mentioning any names, but some of them are very much unfiltered, I think is the way you would put it. No filter. No filter. It's like I often say, I don't get credit for the things I don't say. I often get blamed for the things I do say, And sometimes I think, wow, that was filtered. I mean, imagine if I would have said what I really thought I wanted to say, then, well, what kind of trouble would I be in? I'm just joking. I would never do that. Okay. Any other questions about this?
Not really a question. It's just kind of like something I noticed is that maybe not necessarily my text, but a lot of the texts, even though the pharaohs were kind of deified and expected to be godlike, they were also expected to be people.
Yeah.
It's just kind of
human.
interesting to me.
Well, even here's the thing, though. For a lot, the Egyptian deities and maybe some other ancient deities, they are in our minds if we're looking at it Judeo-Christian point of view, God is completely other. God is so much above us and different than us, right? But for the Egyptian, the gods are really sort of like us, except they're a lot more powerful. They're eternal, and they're powerful, but they still are somewhat like very, very powerful eternal humans rather than something completely different.